The 3 stone chimneys rising from Jakob Müller's cabin looked absurd to everyone who passed by that autumn of 1843. But when the temperature dropped to 30 below zero and stayed there for 5 days straight, those same neighbors who had mocked him would be standing at his door, begging to come inside. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if tales of frontier innovation move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more unbelievable survival technique from the American wilderness. Jakob Müller pushed open the door of the Henderson cabin and immediately knew what he would find. The silence told him everything. It was the second week of December in 1843, and the Iowa Territory settlement had just endured the worst cold snap anyone could remember. 5 days of temperatures that never rose above 20 below zero. 5 nights that dropped to depths the old-timers said they had never witnessed. The Henderson family lay in their beds, frozen. Thomas Henderson, his wife Mary, and their 2 children had burned through their firewood by the 3rd day. Jakob could see the empty wood box near the cold fireplace. They had made the fatal decision to conserve fuel, letting the fire die down during the night. In that cold, it had been enough. Jakob closed the door and marked the cabin with a piece of charcoal. 3 more families to check. He trudged through knee-deep snow to the Schneider place. Same story. The elderly couple had survived, but barely. They were huddled together near their fireplace, alive but suffering from severe frostbite. Jakob helped them to the community hall where survivors had gathered. The pattern became clear as he checked each cabin. The families who had survived were those who had stayed within 5 feet of their fireplaces for the entire 5 days. Anyone who had slept in the far corners of their cabins, anyone who had tried to use the whole space of their home, had either died or suffered terrible cold injuries. Jakob had seen this before. Last winter, his own wife Anna had died of pneumonia that started in the cold back corner of their cabin where they had placed the sleeping area. Their infant daughter Emma had followed her mother 3 days later. Jakob had been helpless, watching them shiver under every blanket he owned, unable to generate enough heat to warm the entire cabin evenly. That loss had broken something in him, but it had also awakened an obsession. He began studying how heat moved through the log cabins that dotted the settlement. He made crude thermometers from glass tubes and colored water. He measured temperatures in every corner of his cabin at different times of day and night. What he discovered horrified him. A standard frontier cabin with a single fireplace had temperatures that varied by as much as 40 degrees from one side to the other. Stand next to the fire and you might be comfortable at 65 degrees. Sleep in the corner farthest from the hearth, and you were living in a space that was barely 30 degrees warmer than outside. In extreme cold, that corner might be only 10 degrees above the exterior temperature. People were building death traps and calling them homes. The single chimney design that every settler used, that every cabin builder had used for generations, was fundamentally flawed. It could not heat a frontier cabin evenly. It created hot zones and cold zones, and in the cold zones, people died. Jakob decided that had to change. The winter of 1842 had started mild. Jakob Müller had felt confident in his preparations. He had cut and stacked 4 cords of firewood, chinked every gap in the cabin walls with fresh mud and moss, and laid in supplies of salted pork, dried beans, and cornmeal that would last until spring. His wife Anna was in her 8th month of pregnancy, and Jakob wanted everything perfect for when the baby arrived. Emma was born on January 10, 1843, during a brief warm spell that fooled everyone into thinking winter might be merciful. She was small but healthy, with Anna's dark eyes and a surprisingly loud cry for such a tiny creature. Jakob held his daughter for the first time and felt a completeness he had not known was possible. The cold arrived 2 weeks later, not gradually, but like a door slamming shut. Temperatures dropped from the mid-20s to below zero in a single night. Jakob kept the fire roaring, feeding it constantly, but he noticed something that worried him. Near the fireplace, the cabin was almost too warm. He had to move back from the flames when he sat to eat. But in the corner where they had set up the sleeping area, away from the fire to keep smoke and sparks away from the baby, the air felt cold despite the roaring blaze just 15 feet away. Anna began coughing on the third day of the cold snap. Just a small cough at first, the kind you dismiss as nothing important. By the 5th day, she was feverish. By the 7th day, she could barely get out of bed. Jakob moved her closer to the fire, dragging the straw mattress across the floor, but the damage was done. Her lungs had taken in too much cold air during those nights in the far corner. Emma started coughing on the 9th day. The baby's tiny body shook with each spasm. Anna, even in her fevered state, tried to keep Emma warm against her chest, but she was too weak to generate much heat herself. Jakob stayed awake for 3 days straight, keeping the fire massive, boiling water to create steam, doing everything he knew to do. Nothing worked. Anna died on February 2nd. Emma followed on February 5th. Jakob buried them both in the frozen ground on the hillside above the settlement, breaking through 2 feet of frost with a pickaxe before he could dig proper graves. The physical labor matched his internal devastation. He returned to his cabin and could not bear to sleep in it. The corner where Anna and Emma had died felt cursed. He spent the next 2 months sleeping near the fireplace, wrapped in blankets, staring at the flames and thinking. The cabin had not protected them. The walls and roof had kept out wind and precipitation, but they had not kept his family warm. The single fireplace had created a zone of safety near its flames and a zone of death in the far corner. That realization would not let him rest. If the cabin design had killed his family, then the design had to change. Jakob began his investigation in March of 1843, as soon as the worst of winter released its grip. He started with his own cabin, taking measurements with tools he fashioned himself. He made thermometers from thin glass tubes he had salvaged from broken lanterns, sealing one end and filling them partway with water tinted red from pokeberry juice. When mounted on wooden boards with marks scratched at regular intervals, they gave him a crude but functional way to measure temperature. He placed 5 of these thermometers around his cabin, one directly beside the fireplace, one 5 feet away, one 10 feet away, one in the corner where Anna and Emma had slept, and one outside mounted on the north wall. Then he began recording temperatures every 2 hours, day and night, for an entire week. The results confirmed what he had suspected, but were more dramatic than he had imagined. With a strong fire burning, the temperature beside the hearth reached 70 degrees. 5 feet away, it dropped to 55. 10 feet away, it was 45. In the far corner, it was 38 degrees. Outside, it was 25. The cabin was creating only 13 degrees of protection in its coldest areas. Jakob visited other cabins in the settlement, bringing his thermometers and asking permission to take measurements. Most people thought he was strange, this grieving man obsessed with numbers and temperatures, but they let him do his work out of sympathy. Every cabin showed the same pattern. Single fireplaces created steep temperature gradients. The heat rose straight up the chimney or radiated outward in a narrow cone. The rest of the cabin depended on whatever warm air happened to circulate, and in a tightly chinked cabin built to keep out drafts, very little air circulated at all. He studied the physics as best he could with his limited education. Heat moved in 3 ways, he learned from an old book on natural philosophy he borrowed from Reverend Carlson. Conduction carried heat through solid materials. Convection moved heat through air and liquids. Radiation sent heat across empty space like light from the sun. A fireplace used all 3 methods, but most effectively it used radiation, in a straight line from the flames. Stand in front of the fire and you felt warm from radiation. Stand to the side or behind a wall and you received almost nothing. Log cabin walls, even well-built ones, conducted some heat from inside to outside. The logs themselves were decent insulators, but the gaps between them, even when chinked, leaked heat continuously. A cabin in winter was fighting a constant battle, with the fire adding heat and the walls leaking it away. With a single heat source in one location, the battle was always lost in the far corners. Jacob realized that the solution was not a bigger fireplace or better insulation. Those would help, but they would not solve the fundamental problem. The solution was multiple heat sources, strategically positioned to eliminate cold zones entirely. Every corner needed its own source of radiated warmth. That meant multiple fireplaces, multiple chimneys. It meant building something no one had built before. Jacob stood in the settlement's meeting hall on a Sunday afternoon in March of 1843, trying to explain his idea to men who looked at him like he had lost his mind. 15 families had gathered to discuss preparations for the next winter. Nobody wanted another season like the last one. But when Jacob proposed his solution, the room erupted in skepticism. 3 chimneys? Samuel Wright laughed, slapping his knee. Man builds one good chimney and calls himself a mason. You want to build 3 and call yourself what? An architect? The other men chuckled. Jacob had expected this. He had brought drawings, measurements, calculations scratched onto pieces of bark and scraps of paper. He held them up, trying to show the logic of his design. The problem is heat distribution, Jacob explained, his German accent thickening as he grew frustrated. One chimney heats one area. The rest of the cabin stays cold. 3 chimneys, positioned correctly, create overlapping zones of warmth. The entire space becomes livable. Overlapping zones, Thomas Mueller mimicked, using an exaggerated professorial tone. Listen to him. Next he will tell us we need to attend university to build a cabin. How much stone you figure 3 chimneys take? John Parker asked, more practical but no less dismissive. Triple the work, triple the materials, triple the time. For what? So you can have a warm privy corner? Jacob tried to explain the mathematics. A single chimney required approximately 800 stones, depending on height and thickness. 3 chimneys would need around 2,000 stones total, but not quite triple because each could be slightly smaller in diameter. The increased efficiency of the system meant you would actually burn less wood over the course of a winter, saving labor in the long run. Less wood, someone muttered. 3 fires burn less than 1 fire. That is some special German mathematics. You control the fires independently, Jacob pressed on. On moderately cold days you burn only 1 or 2. On the coldest days, all 3. The system is flexible, efficient. Reverend Carlson, who commanded respect in the community, finally spoke. Jacob, we understand you lost your family last winter. We all grieve with you. But building some elaborate fortress will not bring them back. Sometimes we must accept that frontier life is hard. People die. It is God's will. The words struck Jacob like a physical blow. They thought this was about grief, about a man unable to accept loss. They could not see past their assumptions about how cabins should be built. Single chimney construction had worked for their fathers and grandfathers. Why change it now? I am building this cabin, Jacob said quietly, with 3 chimneys. You can come see it when I am finished. Then you can decide if I am crazy or if I am right. He gathered his drawings and walked out. Behind him, the conversation shifted to other matters. No one took him seriously. That was fine. Jacob did not need their approval. He needed their survival. Jacob spent April of 1843 conducting experiments that would have looked like madness to anyone watching. He built 3 small model cabins from scrap wood, each 1 foot square, with thin wooden walls and a removable roof. The first model had a single central chimney made from a tin tube. The second had 2 chimneys positioned at opposite corners. The third had 3 chimneys arranged in a triangular pattern. He set up his testing ground in a clearing near his cabin where he could control the variables. Each model cabin got 3 small candles as heat sources, positioned at the base of each chimney. He used his homemade thermometers to measure temperatures at 9 points inside each model, marking a grid pattern on the floor. Then he lit the candles and recorded temperatures every 15 minutes for 6 hours. The results were exactly what he had hoped to see. The single chimney model showed dramatic temperature variation. Points near the chimney reached temperatures 15 degrees above ambient. Points in the far corners barely registered any increase at all. The 2-chimney model performed better, with more even heating, but still left cold spots in the areas farthest from either heat source. The 3-chimney model, with chimneys positioned in a triangle pattern, created overlapping heat zones that covered nearly the entire floor space. No point in the model cabin was more than 8 degrees cooler than the warmest point. The heat distribution was remarkably even, proving that his theory about overlapping radiation zones was correct. Jakob also discovered something unexpected. The 3-chimney model actually used less total fuel than the single-chimney model to achieve better overall heating. This seemed counterintuitive until he understood the mechanism. With a single chimney, you had to burn a very large fire to push heat to the far corners through convection and conduction. Most of that heat escaped up the chimney or through the walls before it reached the cold zones. With 3 smaller fires positioned strategically, the radiated heat reached every area directly with minimal loss. He conducted wind tests, setting up sheets of paper to simulate drafts and observing how they affected heat distribution. He tested different chimney heights and diameters using different sizes of tin tubes. He experimented with reflective surfaces, placing pieces of polished metal behind the heat sources to bounce radiation into specific areas. Every experiment added to his understanding of how to build the most efficient system possible. By the end of April, Jakob had filled an entire notebook with drawings, measurements, and calculations. He knew the optimal spacing between chimneys for a cabin of various sizes. He knew the ideal height and diameter for each chimney to create proper draft without wasting heat. He knew how to position the fireplaces to maximize radiated warmth while minimizing fuel consumption. More importantly, he knew his design would work. The physics were sound. The engineering was practical. All that remained was to build it full scale and prove to the skeptics that a 3-chimney cabin was not just possible, but superior in every way to traditional construction. Jakob selected a building site on high ground with good drainage and clear sight lines. Construction would begin in May. He had 5 months before winter returned. Jakob spent the first 2 weeks of May creating detailed plans for his cabin. He worked at a rough table outside his old cabin, using charcoal on pieces of smoothed wood to draw and redraw his design. The cabin would be 20 feet by 24 feet, larger than the typical 16 by 20 frontier structure. The extra size was necessary to accommodate 3 chimneys without making the interior feel cramped. The chimney placement was critical. Jakob positioned them in a triangular pattern. The first chimney would be in the northwest corner, the second in the northeast corner, and the third along the south wall, centered between the other 2. This arrangement created 3 overlapping circles of radiated heat that covered the entire floor plan with minimal cold spots. He calculated the overlap zones carefully, ensuring that no area of the cabin would be more than 8 feet from a heat source. Each chimney would serve a slightly different purpose. The northwest chimney, positioned where the prevailing winter winds struck the cabin, would be the primary heating source. Its fireplace would be the largest, designed for long-burning fires that could run through the night. The northeast chimney would have a medium-sized fireplace with a cooking crane, serving both heating and meal preparation. The south chimney would have the smallest fireplace, used primarily during extreme cold or to provide supplemental warmth to the sleeping area he planned to position nearby. Jakob designed the fireplaces themselves with careful attention to efficiency. Each would be built with a slightly angled back wall to reflect heat forward into the room. The openings would be sized to create strong draft without allowing excessive heat to escape up the chimney. He planned to include a system of dampers, simple iron plates that could slide across the flue to control airflow and retain heat when the fire burned low. The stone requirements were substantial. Jakob calculated he would need approximately 2,200 limestone blocks of various sizes. The chimneys themselves would consume about 1,800 stones. The foundations beneath each chimney, necessary to support the massive weight, would require another 400. He would need to quarry, shape, and transport every single one. For mortar, he would use a mixture of clay from the creek bed. Sand and lime he would burn himself from limestone in a pit kiln. The lime burning alone would take 2 weeks and require careful attention to temperature and timing. But proper mortar was essential. These chimneys had to last decades without cracking or allowing smoke to leak into the living space. The logs for the cabin walls would come from oak trees he had already selected and marked. 24 trees would provide the 60 logs he needed, each one at least 25 feet long and 14 inches in diameter. He would cut them in early June, peel them immediately, and let them season through the summer while he worked on the stonework. Jakob reviewed his plans one final time. The design was sound. The materials were available. The timeline was tight but achievable. He rolled up his drawings and prepared to begin the most ambitious construction project the settlement had ever seen. Jakob began quarrying limestone in mid-May of 1843. He had located a suitable outcrop 3 miles from his building site, an exposed cliff face where weather and erosion had already done some of the work. The limestone here was dense and relatively uniform, perfect for chimney construction. He would spend the next 3 months moving stone. His tools were simple but effective: a heavy sledgehammer, 3 iron wedges, a pry bar, and a stone chisel he had forged himself from an old wagon axle. He worked the quarry face systematically, looking for natural fracture lines where the limestone had already begun to separate into layers. He would drive wedges into these cracks, hammering them deeper until sections broke free. Some stones split cleanly into usable blocks. Others required additional shaping with the chisel. Each day, Jakob quarried between 15 and 20 stones. He sorted them by size and shape, setting aside the flattest pieces for the chimney bases and the most regular blocks for the visible exterior surfaces. Irregular pieces would work fine for the interior portions of the chimneys, where appearance did not matter. Nothing was wasted. Transportation was the most physically demanding part. Jakob built a simple stone boat, a flat sledge made from 2 thick oak planks joined by cross pieces. He could load 6 or 7 stones onto this sledge, depending on their size, and drag it behind his ox. The round trip took 4 hours. 3 trips per day meant he could move approximately 20 stones from quarry to building site, matching his quarrying rate. By early June, Jakob had stockpiled 300 stones at his site. Neighbors who passed by shook their heads at the growing pile. "Mueller is building a castle," they joked. "Maybe he thinks he is back in the old country." Jakob ignored the comments and continued working. He was ahead of schedule. While quarrying continued, Jakob also spent time preparing his mortar materials. He dug clay from a bend in the creek where erosion exposed a thick layer of pure gray clay. He hauled it in barrels, letting it dry in the sun until he could break it into chunks and store it. He collected sand from a gravel bar downstream, sifting out stones and debris until he had clean, fine sand. The lime burning was a project unto itself. Jakob built a temporary kiln from stones, a dome-shaped structure with a firebox at the bottom and a chimney at the top. He loaded it with limestone pieces and sealed it except for the fire opening. Then he burned hardwood in the firebox for 5 days straight, maintaining temperatures hot enough to drive the carbon dioxide out of the limestone and convert it to quicklime. The process required constant attention and careful fire management. When the kiln cooled, Jakob had approximately 300 pounds of quicklime, enough to make mortar for all 3 chimneys. He stored it in sealed barrels to keep it dry. Moisture would ruin it. By the end of June, all materials were ready. Jakob had stone, mortar components, and timber. Construction could begin. Jakob broke ground on the 1st of July, 1843. He started with the foundations for his 3 chimneys, knowing that everything depended on these bases being absolutely solid and level. A chimney built on a weak or tilted foundation would crack and fail, possibly burning down the cabin it was meant to heat. For each chimney foundation, he dug a pit 4 feet square and 3 feet deep, down to undisturbed subsoil. The digging was brutal work in the July heat, breaking through root-filled topsoil and dense clay. Each pit took a full day to complete. He lined the bottom 6 inches with gravel for drainage, tamping it down hard with a wooden post. Then came the foundation stones, the largest and flattest pieces from his quarry pile. Jakob mixed his first batch of mortar, combining 1 part quicklime, 1 part clay, and 3 parts sand with just enough water to make a thick paste. The proportions were critical. Too much water and the mortar would be weak. Too little and it would not bond properly. He laid the foundation stones in courses, each stone bedded in mortar and carefully leveled using a wooden frame with a water-filled glass tube he had rigged as a spirit level. The first course of each foundation rose to ground level. He let them cure for 3 days, keeping them damp with wet canvas to prevent the mortar from drying too quickly and cracking. The second and third courses of the foundations rose above ground, creating solid platforms 2 feet high on which the actual chimneys would stand. Jakob built these courses with extra care, selecting stones with flat tops to provide perfect surfaces for the chimney bases. He checked level constantly, shimming with thin stone chips where necessary. A chimney even slightly out of plumb would lean dangerously once it reached full height. While the foundations cured, Jakob prepared the cabin floor area. He scraped away topsoil and vegetation, then spread a 6-inch layer of gravel over the entire 20 by 24-foot footprint. This would keep moisture from rising into the cabin and provide good drainage. Over the gravel, he laid a floor of split logs, flat side up, fitted tightly together. The floor would sit directly on the gravel, with no air gap where cold could gather. By mid-July, the 3 foundations stood complete and cured. They were massively overbuilt by normal standards, each one capable of supporting 5 times the weight of the chimney that would sit on it. But Jakob wanted no possibility of settling or shifting. These chimneys would stand for generations. He began laying the first course of the northwest chimney on July 18th. The base was 3 feet square on the outside, with the interior flue opening measuring 14 inches by 14 inches. He used his largest, most regular stones for these visible courses, fitting them together with thin mortar joints. The work was slow and exacting. Each stone had to be perfect. The impossible structure was beginning to take physical form. Jakob approached chimney construction with the precision of a craftsman building a clock. Each stone had to be selected not just for size, but for shape, weight distribution, and how it would interlock with its neighbors. He spent as much time examining his stone pile as he did actually laying stones, holding each piece up to the growing chimney, turning it in his hands, imagining how it would fit. The northwest chimney rose first, growing at a rate of about 8 inches per day. Jakob built the exterior walls 2 stones thick, creating a sandwich of outer stones, mortar, and inner stones. The double wall provided insulation and structural strength. Between the stone walls and the interior flue, he left a 1-inch gap that he filled with a mixture of clay and ash. This insulating layer would keep the outer stones from getting dangerously hot while retaining heat inside the flue to maintain strong draft. Every fifth course, Jakob laid a stone that extended slightly inward, creating a corbel. These corbels would eventually support a smoke shelf, a horizontal ledge inside the chimney that served multiple purposes. It caught downdrafts and directed them back upward. It prevented rain from falling straight down into the fire. It created turbulence that improved draft. Most frontier chimneys lacked this feature, but Jakob had read about it in a book about European masonry and understood its value. The fireplace opening itself required careful engineering. Jakob shaped an arch from stones he had specifically selected for their wedge-like profiles. He built a temporary wooden form to support the arch stones while the mortar cured. The arch distributed the weight of the chimney above across the sides of the opening, eliminating the need for a wooden lintel that could burn. Everything touching the fire would be stone. He designed the firebox with slanted side walls that angled inward toward the back. This created a funnel effect that directed heat forward into the room rather than straight up the chimney. The back wall slanted forward from bottom to top, creating another reflecting surface that bounced radiated heat outward. These angles were not arbitrary. Jakob had calculated them based on his model tests to maximize heat radiation while maintaining sufficient draft. By early August, the northwest chimney stood 6 feet tall, rising above where the cabin roof would eventually be. Jakob built in a damper mechanism at this height, a simple iron plate that could slide across the flue opening on metal tracks. By adjusting the damper, he could control how much air flowed through the chimney, regulating both heat output and fuel consumption. It was an innovation he had never seen on any frontier cabin. The northeast chimney began on August 8th. This one incorporated a cooking crane, an iron arm that could swing in and out of the fireplace to hold pots over the flames. Jakob had forged the crane himself during evening hours, heating and hammering scrap iron into the necessary shapes. The crane mounted on a pivot stone, specially shaped with a socket to hold the vertical post. The 3 chimneys were not identical. Each was optimized for its specific purpose, but all shared the same fundamental design principles that would make Jakob's cabin the warmest structure in the territory. As the 3 chimneys rose above the future roofline, Jakob implemented the most radical aspect of his design. He was not building 3 independent heating systems. He was building one integrated system that would allow him to control heat distribution throughout the cabin with unprecedented precision. At a height of 7 feet, where the chimneys passed through what would be the cabin's roof, Jakob began constructing horizontal passages that connected all 3 flues. These passages were 6 inches square, too small for smoke to flow through in significant quantities, but large enough to equalize air pressure between the chimneys. The connections meant that the 3 chimneys would function as a single draft system rather than competing with each other. The physics were subtle but important. When one fireplace burned hot, it created strong updraft in its chimney. Without connections, this could actually create backdraft in the other chimneys, pulling cold air down into the cabin through the unused fireplaces. The connecting passages prevented this by allowing air pressure to balance across all 3 flues. Burn one fire or all 3 fires, and the draft would remain stable in every chimney. Jakob installed iron dampers in each connecting passage, allowing him to open or close the connections as needed. In mild weather, he could close the dampers and operate each chimney independently, burning a single small fire without affecting the others. In severe cold, he could open all dampers and burn 3 fires, creating a synchronized system where all 3 chimneys worked together to heat the cabin evenly. The damper controls extended down into the cabin interior on iron rods, ending at handles mounted on the wall. Jakob could adjust all 6 dampers, 3 in the chimneys and 3 in the connecting passages, without climbing onto the roof or going outside. This meant he could fine-tune the heating system in response to changing weather without exposing himself to the cold. Above the connecting passages, the 3 chimneys continued upward independently. Jakob built them to different heights based on their positions. The northwest chimney, which would be closest to tall trees that might create downdrafts, rose 12 feet above the roofline. The northeast chimney rose 10 feet. The south chimney, sheltered by the cabin itself, needed only 8 feet of height to draft properly. Each chimney topped out with a stone cap that extended beyond the flue opening, keeping rain and snow from falling directly down into the fireplaces. The caps were slightly domed to shed water and angled to deflect wind upward, which actually improved draft rather than hindering it. Jakob had observed this effect on church steeples and applied the same principle to his chimneys. By late August, all 3 chimneys stood complete from foundation to cap. They dominated the landscape, visible from a mile away across the prairie. Neighbors who rode by stared at the 3 stone towers rising from what was still just a marked-out rectangle on the ground. The ridicule had quieted somewhat. The sheer scale and craftsmanship of what Jakob had built demanded a certain respect, even from skeptics. Now came the cabin itself. The chimneys were ready. The structure around them had to match their quality. Jakob began raising the cabin walls in September of 1843, working around his 3 completed chimneys like a shipbuilder constructing a vessel around its masts. The logs had been cut in June and had seasoned through the hot summer months, drying and stabilizing. Each log weighed between 400 and 500 pounds. Moving them into position required leverage, rollers, and careful planning. The first course of logs sat directly on the gravel foundation, notched at the corners in a traditional saddle joint. But Jakob added a refinement. He cut a groove along the length of each log's upper surface and filled it with oakum, rope fibers soaked in pine tar. When the next log settled into place, the oakum compressed to create an airtight seal. This took extra time, but eliminated the gaps that typically appeared between logs as they settled and dried. Building the walls around the existing chimneys presented unique challenges. Jakob had to cut precise notches in the logs where they met each chimney, creating tight joints between wood and stone. He packed these joints with clay mixed with horsehair, which would remain flexible as the wood expanded and contracted with humidity and temperature changes. The chimneys were rigid. The wood would move. The joint material had to accommodate that movement without cracking. The interior layout was dictated entirely by heat distribution. Jakob positioned the sleeping area along the south wall, between the south chimney and the nearest corner. This spot would receive radiated heat from 2 sources, the south fireplace directly and the southwest corner fireplace at an angle. Even with only 1 fire burning, this area would stay comfortably warm. The cooking and food preparation area surrounded the northeast chimney, making use of the cooking crane and taking advantage of the heat for food storage. In winter, this area would stay warm enough to prevent root vegetables from freezing, but cool enough to preserve meat for extended periods. It was a natural cold storage zone that was not actually cold. The main living area occupied the northwest section of the cabin, anchored by the largest fireplace. This is where Jakob would spend his waking hours, where he would work on equipment repairs and other tasks that required good light and warmth. The northwest window was positioned to catch afternoon light and provide ventilation in summer. Jakob built interior walls from vertical planks, dividing the single room into semi-separate spaces without blocking heat circulation. The dividers extended only 7 feet high, leaving 3 feet of open space below the ceiling where warm air could flow freely. This allowed heat to move throughout the cabin while still providing visual privacy and wind protection. He constructed a sleeping platform raised 18 inches off the floor. Warm air rises, and even that small elevation would make a significant difference in sleeping comfort. The platform was built from split logs topped with woven rope to support a straw mattress. Simple, but effective. Storage shelves lined the walls between the chimneys, mounted high enough to keep supplies away from any moisture that might accumulate near the floor. Jacob built these shelves with the same attention to detail he had given everything else. Every element served multiple purposes. Every choice enhanced survivability. Jacob lit fires in all 3 fireplaces for the first time on September 28, 1843. The cabin walls stood complete, but the roof was still open to the sky, allowing him to observe the chimney's draft without smoke filling the interior. He used small fires, just enough to generate heat and test the system's basic functionality. All 3 chimneys drew properly. Smoke rose straight up without backdraft or spillage into the cabin space. The connecting passages worked as intended, equalizing pressure between the flues. Jacob adjusted the dampers, opening and closing various combinations, observing how each configuration affected the draft. He made notes on which settings produced the best results for different scenarios. With the roof still open, he could not test heat distribution, but he could identify problems with the chimneys themselves. The northeast chimney showed slightly weaker draft than the others. Jacob examined it carefully and realized the problem. A section of the flue about 4 feet up had a slight bulge where he had fitted stones poorly. The irregularity disrupted smooth airflow. Fixing it meant dismantling part of the chimney. Jacob removed 12 courses of stones, corrected the alignment, and rebuilt the section with more care. It took 3 days. When he tested again, the draft was perfect, matching the other 2 chimneys. The delay was frustrating, but Jacob knew that accepting a flaw now would mean living with that flaw every day for years. He completed the roof in early October. Unlike typical cabin roofs with simple pole frames, Jacob built a structure designed to work with his heating system. The rafters were spaced to create 3 distinct roof sections, each one sloping away from the nearest chimney. This prevented snow from accumulating in valleys between chimneys where it might melt, refreeze, and create ice dams. The roof itself was layered. First came split shingles, overlapped in traditional style. Over these, Jacob laid birch bark in large sheets, overlapping and sealed with pine tar. Over the bark, he spread a layer of clay mixed with straw. Finally, he covered everything with sod cut from the prairie, grass side up. The multiple layers provided insulation and made the roof nearly fireproof. Sparks from the chimneys would land on living grass, not dry wood. With the roof complete, Jacob could conduct his first real test of the heating system. He lit fires in all 3 fireplaces on October 15th. A cool evening when the outside temperature dropped to 35 degrees. He placed his thermometers at various points around the cabin and monitored temperatures for 6 hours. The results exceeded his expectations. With moderate fires burning in all 3 fireplaces, the cabin maintained an even 62 to 65 degrees throughout the interior. No area was more than 3 degrees cooler than any other. He was burning less wood than a single large fireplace would have required, yet heating the entire space comfortably. The neighbors who had mocked him began riding by more frequently, finding excuses to stop and look. Jacob said nothing. He simply continued his refinements, preparing for the real test that winter would bring. November of 1843 began cold and grew colder. By the 2nd week, temperatures were dropping below 0 at night. By the 3rd week, they were not rising above 0 during the day. Old-timers in the settlement muttered that they had never seen anything like it. The cold was relentless, steady, crushing in its intensity. Jacob kept detailed records. On November 22nd, his outdoor thermometer read 8 degrees below 0 at dawn. By afternoon, it had climbed to 2 below. That night, it dropped to 15 below. The pattern continued for 3 days, each night slightly colder than the last. On November 25th, the temperature fell to 22 below zero and simply stayed there. The settlement went quiet. People stayed inside, burning through their firewood supplies at alarming rates. Smoke rose from chimneys across the valley, thin columns in the still air. There was no wind, which was both blessing and curse. No wind meant no wind chill, but it also meant the cold settled like a weight, pressing down, seeping through every crack and gap. Jakob burned fires in all 3 of his fireplaces, but kept them moderate. He did not need massive blazes. His system was designed for exactly this situation. He monitored his interior temperatures every 2 hours, recording the numbers in his notebook by firelight. The northwest corner held at 63 degrees, the northeast corner at 64, the south wall at 62, the center of the cabin at 65. He was using approximately 12 logs per day, 4 in each fireplace. A typical cabin would burn 15 to 20 logs, maintaining a single large fire, and still leave cold corners. Jakob's system was more efficient by every measure. He had proven it with his own survival, but proof meant nothing if no one else needed it yet. On November 27th, the temperature dropped to 28 below zero. Jakob woke to find frost patterns on the inside of his windows, despite the triple glazing he had installed. The cold was finding every possible entry point, testing the cabin's defenses. He added slightly more wood to each fire, increasing the heat output just enough to counter the increased cold. His interior temperature held steady. That afternoon, Samuel Wright appeared at Jakob's door. Wright, who had mocked the 3-chimney design most loudly, stood shivering in the cold, his face red from exposure. "Mueller," he said, his breath fogging in the air. "My cabin, the back corner where my children sleep, it is frozen. Ice on the walls. I cannot keep it warm." Jakob invited him inside. Wright stepped through the door and stopped, staring. The cabin was comfortably warm everywhere, not just near the fires. You could stand in any corner and feel genuine heat. "How?" Wright began, then stopped. He understood how. He just had not believed it would work this well. "Bring your family here," Jakob said. "Tonight, before it gets colder." "It can get colder than this?" Wright asked. Jakob pointed to his thermometer. "It will reach 30 below tonight, maybe lower. Tomorrow will be worse." Wright left to get his family. Jakob knew others would follow. By nightfall on November 27th, Jakob's cabin held 9 people. The Wright family arrived first, Samuel carrying his youngest daughter wrapped in every blanket they owned. His wife Martha followed with their 2 sons, both boys shaking from cold despite layers of clothing. They had walked 1/4 of a mile from their cabin, and that brief exposure had nearly frozen them. Thomas and Margaret Henderson came next, the same Hendersons who had lost family members in the previous winter's cold. They brought no apologies for their earlier skepticism, but their presence was acknowledgement enough. Margaret's hands were blue from cold. Jakob sat her near the south fireplace and brought her hot tea. John and Elizabeth Parker arrived with their infant son just before dark. Elizabeth was crying, not from cold, but from fear. "His lips were turning blue," she said. "In our own cabin, I could not get him warm." Jakob showed her the sleeping platform where the baby would be safe and comfortable, positioned between 2 heat sources that would maintain steady warmth through the night. Jakob organized the space efficiently. The families settled into areas based on their needs. The Parkers with their infant took the prime sleeping area near the south wall. The Hendersons, both elderly, positioned themselves close to the northeast fireplace, where they could tend it during the night. The Wrights spread out in the main living area, the children sleeping near the northwest fireplace. Jakob took first watch, maintaining the fires and monitoring temperatures. He burned through wood steadily but not wastefully, adding logs in a rotation that kept all 3 fires burning at moderate intensity. Every 2 hours he walked through the cabin checking on his guests. Everyone slept deeply, exhausted from days of fighting the cold in their inadequate homes. At midnight, Jacob's outdoor thermometer read 32 below zero. He added extra logs to each fireplace and adjusted the dampers to increase draft slightly. The cabin temperature held at 64 degrees. Outside, exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Inside, children slept comfortably under single blankets. Samuel Wright woke for a few minutes around 2 in the morning and found Jacob adding wood to the northwest fire. "You planned for this," Wright said quietly. "Not just the chimneys, everything. The layout, the sleeping areas. You knew exactly how it would work." "I watched my wife and daughter die from cold," Jacob replied. "I will not watch it happen to anyone else if I can prevent it." Wright nodded and returned to his family. At dawn on November 28th, the temperature outside had dropped to 34 below zero. Inside the cabin, people woke slowly, warm and rested. The children played quietly. The adults sat near the fires, drinking coffee Jacob brewed on the cooking crane, talking in low voices about how close they had come to disaster. The Parker's baby, who had been dangerously cold the night before, was pink and healthy, nursing contentedly. Elizabeth Parker looked at Jacob with tears in her eyes. "You saved his life," she said. Jacob shook his head. "The cabin saved him. The design, the planning, that is what saved him." But everyone knew better. November 28th brought more refugees. By mid-morning, the Schneider family appeared, the elderly couple who had barely survived the previous winter. Hans Schneider's hands were wrapped in cloth, frostbitten from the short walk to Jacob's cabin. His wife Greta was coughing, the same rattling cough that preceded pneumonia. Jakob settled them in the warmest spot in the cabin, directly between the south and southwest fireplaces. Michael and Sarah Coleman arrived at noon with their 3 daughters. Their cabin had been tolerable until that morning, when the temperature inside dropped below 40 degrees despite a roaring fire. "We were burning furniture," Michael admitted. "We ran out of firewood 2 days ago. We thought we could make it to spring. We were wrong." Jakob's cabin now held 17 people in a space designed for 1. But the 3-chimney system handled the load without strain. More people meant more body heat, which actually reduced the demand on the fireplaces. Jakob adjusted his burning schedule, letting the fires run slightly smaller since the combined warmth of 17 humans contributed significantly to the interior temperature. Food became the immediate concern. Jakob had supplies for himself through winter, but not for 17 people for an extended period. The families had brought what they could carry, but it was not much. Jakob inventoried everything and calculated they had enough for 5 days if they rationed carefully. After that, someone would need to venture out to retrieve supplies from the abandoned cabins. The temperature outside reached 36 below zero that afternoon. Jakob's outdoor thermometer could not measure lower, so he did not know if it dropped further during the night. He maintained the fires, rotating through the cabin every hour, checking on people, especially the elderly and the infant. Greta Schneider's cough worsened through the day. By evening, she was feverish. Jakob recognized the signs from Anna's illness. Pneumonia was setting in. But unlike Anna, Greta was in a warm cabin with consistent heat. Her body had the support it needed to fight the infection. Jakob kept her hydrated with hot tea and positioned near the fire where she could breathe warm, moist air. As night fell on the 3rd day of extreme cold, Jakob gathered everyone and explained the situation honestly. "The cold will break eventually. It always does, but we do not know when. We have food for 5 days. We have firewood for perhaps 10 days at our current burn rate. If the cold lasts longer than that, we will need to make difficult decisions about who goes out to gather more wood." "I will go," Samuel Wright said immediately. "You built this place. You are keeping us alive. I can gather wood." Others volunteered as well. The mood in the cabin had shifted from fear to determination. People understood they were not just surviving the cold, they were proving that Jacob's design worked, that his innovation could be replicated, that no one else had to die from cold in a frontier cabin ever again. Outside, the temperature held at 35 below zero. Inside, 17 people survived comfortably, living proof of what knowledge and careful planning could accomplish. The cold broke on December 2nd, 1843. The temperature rose to 0, then 10 above, then by afternoon reached 20 degrees. To people who had endured 5 days of 30 below temperatures, 20 degrees felt like spring. The air itself seemed lighter, easier to breathe, less hostile. Jacob opened the cabin door for the first time in 3 days and stepped outside. The world was transformed. Every surface wore thick frost. Trees were white with ice crystals. The snow had a hard crust that crunched under his boots. Smoke rose from a few chimneys across the settlement, thin, desperate wisps from cabins where people had managed to survive. But not everyone had survived. Over the next 2 days, as families ventured out to check on neighbors, they found 3 cabins where people had frozen to death. The Morrison family, parents and 2 teenage children, had died in their sleep when their fire went out and they lacked the strength to relight it. Old William Grant, living alone, was found frozen near his cold fireplace, surrounded by empty wood boxes. The Pattersons' infant daughter had died despite their desperate efforts to keep her warm. 11 deaths from 5 days of cold. It shocked the settlement into recognition. This was not just harsh weather. This was a fundamental problem with how they were living, with the structures they trusted to protect them. On December 5th, Reverend Carlson called a community meeting in the church, the only building large enough to hold everyone. Jacob attended reluctantly, uncomfortable with attention. The Reverend asked him to stand before the congregation and explain his cabin design. Jacob brought his drawings and his notebook full of temperature measurements. He spoke in his accented English about heat distribution, thermal zones, and the physics of radiation. Some people understood immediately. Others needed time to grasp the concepts. But everyone understood the fundamental reality that Jacob's cabin had sheltered 17 people comfortably, while others had died in traditional cabins. Samuel Wright stood and spoke without prompting. I mocked this man. I called him crazy. I laughed at his 3 chimneys. Then, when my family was freezing, I came to him for help. He took us in without hesitation, without judgment. His cabin saved my children's lives. Wright's voice cracked with emotion. I was wrong. We were all wrong. Others spoke as well. Margaret Henderson described how the cold corners of traditional cabins had killed before and would kill again unless something changed. Michael Coleman explained how they had burned through their firewood desperately trying to heat an inefficient cabin. Elizabeth Parker simply held up her healthy baby boy. The meeting ended with 7 families requesting that Jacob help them design and build cabins using his 3-chimney system. Some wanted to modify existing structures, others wanted to start fresh with new construction. All recognized that the old ways were inadequate. Jacob agreed to help, but with one condition. I will teach anyone who wants to learn. I will share every detail of the design, but you must promise to share it further. Tell others, help them build safely. Knowledge saves lives only when it spreads. The community agreed. The revolution in frontier cabin design had begun. Spring of 1844 brought unprecedented construction activity to the settlement. As soon as the ground thawed enough to dig foundations, 7 families began building new cabins or extensively modifying existing ones. Jacob moved between construction sites, teaching, advising, and occasionally correcting mistakes before they became permanent. The Wrights built first. Samuel had spent the winter studying Jacob's design, asking questions, taking notes. His cabin would not be identical to Jacob's. He adapted the concept to a smaller structure, using 2 chimneys instead of 3 for his 16 by 18-foot cabin. The 2 chimneys positioned diagonally across from each other created overlapping heat zones that covered the smaller space adequately. Jakob helped Samuel with the critical details: the foundation depth, the flue dimensions, the damper mechanisms, the connecting passage that equalized pressure between the 2 chimneys. Samuel proved to be a capable mason. His stones fitted tightly, and his mortar mixed properly. By late May, the Wright family moved into a cabin that would keep them safe for generations. The Hendersons modified their existing cabin rather than building new. They added a second chimney to their structure, positioning it to eliminate the cold corner where family members had died. The modification required cutting through existing walls and building a foundation under the cabin floor. Difficult work that took 3 weeks, but when finished, their cabin had no dead zones. Heat reached every corner. John Parker built the most ambitious version of the design, a large cabin with 3 chimneys arranged exactly like Jakob's. Parker was a carpenter by training, and he added refinements to the interior layout that Jakob admired. Movable panel walls that could be adjusted seasonally to control airflow. A sleeping loft positioned to take advantage of rising heat from all 3 fireplaces. Storage compartments built into the stone chimney bases where the radiated heat would keep food from freezing. By summer's end, 9 cabins in the settlement had multiple chimneys. The sight became normal rather than strange. Travelers passing through commented on the unusual architecture, and settlers explained the reasoning. Some visitors were skeptical until they heard the survival stories from the previous winter. Then they took notes and asked detailed questions. Jakob's design spread beyond the immediate settlement. Travelers carried the concept west along the emigrant trails. Letters sent back east described the 3 chimney cabins and their remarkable efficiency. A circuit-riding preacher sketched Jakob's cabin in his journal and showed the drawing at settlements throughout the territory. Frontier newspapers published articles about the Mueller system of cabin heating. Not everyone adopted the design. It required more initial labor and materials than traditional construction. Some settlers remained convinced that hard work and stoicism were sufficient to survive frontier winters. But those who had experienced life-threatening cold, or who valued their family's safety above convenience, began building with multiple chimneys. By 1846, variations of Jakob's design existed in settlements across Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota territories. The exact implementation varied by region and available materials, but the core principle remained constant. Multiple heat sources, strategically positioned, eliminated cold zones and saved lives. The impossible had become standard practice. Innovation born from tragedy had transformed frontier survival. Jakob Mueller died on March 14, 1871, at the age of 63, in the same cabin he had built 28 years earlier. His children and grandchildren gathered around him in the warm interior, the 3 chimneys still functioning perfectly after nearly 3 decades of continuous use. He had lived to see his innovations spread across the frontier and had trained 2 generations of builders in the techniques that made it work. The settlement that had mocked his 3 chimneys in 1843 had grown into a small town of 200 families by 1871. 47 of those families lived in multi-chimney cabins based directly on Jakob's design. Others had incorporated elements of his approach into more conventional structures. The town had not lost a single resident to cold-related death since the terrible winter of 1843. Jakob's original cabin passed to his eldest son, Friedrich, who maintained it with the same careful attention his father had shown. The cabin would remain occupied continuously until 1923, 80 years after its construction. 3 generations of the Mueller family lived their entire lives in the warmth and safety Jakob's grief and determination had created. In the late 1800s, as frontier architecture evolved and professional builders brought more sophisticated heating systems west, the three-chimney design gradually fell out of use for new construction. Cast iron stoves and later forced air furnaces offered easier solutions to the heating problem. But the cabins Jakob had influenced remained, sturdy and functional, scattered across the upper Midwest. Modern historians stumbled upon the phenomenon almost by accident. A graduate student studying frontier architecture in 1978 noticed an unusual concentration of multi-chimney cabins in eastern Iowa and began investigating. She found Jakob's original cabin, still standing though no longer occupied, and traced the design's spread through property records, letters, and newspaper archives. Her dissertation documented how one man's response to personal tragedy had influenced frontier building practices across 3 territories and had likely saved dozens of lives. Several of Jakob's cabins survived into the 21st century as historical curiosities. The original Mueller cabin was restored by the County Historical Society and open to visitors. Tourists walked through the space, marveling at the 3 massive chimneys, reading the plaques that explained Jakob's innovation. They felt the intelligent design and how the space was organized, how every element served multiple purposes, how one man's obsessive attention to detail had created something that lasted centuries. The most complete documentation came from Jakob's own notebook, preserved by his descendants and eventually donated to a museum. Page after page of calculations, measurements, sketches, and temperature readings told the story of a mind working through a problem with relentless focus. The grief over his wife and daughter was visible in the dates and the careful script. So was the determination that their deaths would not be meaningless. Jakob never claimed to be an inventor or innovator. He insisted he had simply applied known principles in a new way. But in doing so, he had proven that the frontier's deadliest problems often had solutions that did not require new technology or expensive materials. They required only knowledge, care, and the willingness to reject the old ways when the old ways were killing people.